Well, howdy everybody, and welcome back to the farm. Today we're going to be cooking up some conspiracies about our distant past. You can't talk about aliens all the time. Sometimes you got to talk about humans. And so, since I refuse to talk about ordinary humans in our contemporary world, we're going to be talking about people who did things that were so exceptional, who were such heroic or capable people, or people who were destined for such greatness that we remember them by name 3,000 years later. And so, yes, we are continuing our discussion of the Bronze Age collapse, but luckily, in our last episode, we got a lot of the groundwork and the boring stuff out of the way. So in this episode, we can concentrate on talking about some of the specific places, specific events, and in particular, the specific people involved with some of the events that we can know something about. Like I said in the last episode, the Exodus story and the Homeric epics give us most of our best information about what the heck was going on during this chaotic and mostly unremembered period in human history, from about 1200 BC to 800 BC. A big 400-year gap of nothing but scraps or rumors. And most of the written information we have about this period wasn't written down for another 300 or 400 years after the events. So we should expect some distortion, and we should expect some exaggerations. Some events can become legends, and legends can become myths over time. So we're going to kind of bounce back and forth between the events of the Odyssey in particular and the story of Moses leading this group of rebellious, servile people out of their servitude and their second-class citizen status in Egypt, roaming through the desert to the west of Egypt in the Sinai Peninsula, trying to get back to this promised land in Canaan, back east. I'm going to argue that it's back east where they came from originally. We're going to talk about the settlement of the original Canaanites that would become Israelites. And this is discussed at the end of Genesis. The story of Joseph settling these Canaanites into this area of Egypt that was called Goshen in Hebrew. And we're going to talk about Troy, the city that is central to Homer's epics. And for a long time, people doubted whether it really existed or not, at least in the form that Homer describes. But in the late 19th century, this archaeologist named Heinrich Schliemann discovered Troy, and it took him a while to convince the rest of the world that this was the actual Troy of Homer. And here's a case where archaeology has produced some actionable intelligence for our investigation into the past. And so what did the archaeologists find when they excavated Troy? Well, they found a bunch of layers, because that site had been occupied for a long time, since the Paleolithic period. So there were a lot of layers. In fact, they've been able to delineate 7 different Troys. And what do you know? The reason why Troy passed into legend after the Trojan War is because the site was not rebuilt completely after its destruction around 1180 BC. And some people, like me, think that you can narrow that down to actually 1179. So the last and greatest Troy, the Troy of Homer, the Troy of King Priam and Paris and Hector, that was destroyed, that was leveled in 1179 BC. And according to the archaeologists, there's not a lot of doubt as to what happened. Troy 6, the previous version of Troy, was destroyed, but it appears to have been destroyed by an earthquake, because there was no evidence of widespread, deliberate fires. There weren't caches of bodies, or arrowheads, or sling stones. And the city appears to have been quickly rebuilt and restored to its glorious previous state. And in fact, the walls of Troy that Agamemnon's expeditionary force had to face down were pretty impressive. Homer goes on and on about Troy's defensive works and how impenetrable they were. And sure enough, the walls of the last version of Troy was a pretty impressive fortress. Now, some archaeologists have argued that there was a clear decline in material culture at this site that reflected the overall decline of the late Bronze Age. So the attack of the Sea Peoples appears to have been one of the final straws, not the ultimate cause. There was already tension and deprivation and reduced trade because of piracy and instability and poverty in general. And so this Troy number 7 was destroyed in 1179 BC, and it was not an earthquake. The layer of ash and destruction that we see at Troy 7 reflects a very brutal and decisive military action. So I think we're seeing the actual ashes from the fire set by Odysseus and the other Danaoi who had laid siege to Troy. And we're going to talk about the motivations behind this. Homer definitely does not claim that Agamemnon's expeditionary force was just trying to get some loot or some food, that they were hungry back home, that they were coming across the sea on a raid, on a robbing spree, like straight G's. No, Homer gives us a different picture. Homer says that this was politically motivated. And remember, when your government is just the whims of a brutal warlord and his family and favorites, well, that has a tendency to make politics very personal. So you might be thinking, well, no, Vincent, it was Helen, right? It was because Helen was so beautiful and she was stolen away by a Trojan prince. And so Agamemnon had to raise an army to defend his honor. Well, I'm going to argue that that's kind of right. That kind of incident may have actually happened. But in general, I think the story of Helen reflects a sense of having been disrespected or used by these greater powers on the eastern coast. Later, we're going to see people who are actually living in and around Egypt who rose up against the Egyptian pharaoh and his government because of grievances they had about working conditions or the availability of food or taxes. So there was a lot of unrest, a lot of anger, a lot of blame, a lot of deprivation. So we're going to talk about labor strikes in Egypt and when they occurred and why. because it's going to shed a lot of light on the Exodus story, because Exodus and the Odyssey are much more connected than I think people realize. Troy was destroyed by Odysseus and his friends in 1179 BC. And so let's think about what happened after they destroyed Troy. After Troy became just a little town in the classical period, when Alexander the Great led his army into what's now Turkey, he was there to conquer, not to destroy. He wanted to create an empire, a wealthy, thriving, multicultural empire. So he didn't want to burn or steal anything. In fact, after Alexander conquered a region, after public oaths were taken, Alexander generally left cities to govern themselves in whatever fashion their culture decided. He certainly thought a lot of himself, and he allowed this rumor to persist that he was actually the son of Zeus and not Philip II. But that's a rumor that can't really hurt you. Anyway, let's contrast what Alexander did to what Odysseus and his gang did. And they were kind of a gang. If you read Homer's epics, it becomes clear that this is just a big throng of warlords and their guys coming to get some loot. After the incident with the wooden horse allowed the ragtag Danaoi to trick their way through Troy's massive gates, they didn't conquer it. They didn't establish a new government. They didn't take oaths. They didn't make a trade deal or a tax obligation. Nope. They just ransacked the city for everything valuable, packed it up in bags, just like a kind of reverse Santa Claus operation. Then they gathered up whoever they wanted to take back as slaves of various kinds. Then they torched the city. They destroyed it. They wanted it to not be around anymore. They erased it. They literally almost succeeded in erasing it. They turned a proud and prosperous city into a pile of ash that would pass into legend. So they were not building empires. They were raiders. They just rolled up on them on their little ships and just dragged them onto the beach and built a little settlement there right on the beach, and then harassed the surrounding peasantry, and then lay siege to the city. So I'm going to argue that Odysseus and his gang were actual sea people. These sea peoples that the Egyptians blame the Bronze Age collapse on, the sea peoples that the Egyptian records claim came from the west primarily, and destroyed cities along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean. And after doing that, they turned their attention on the big prize, Egypt. The richest state-level society in the ancient world at the time. And if you think these events aren't related, well, how about this? Troy was destroyed in 1179 BC, and the reign of terror of the sea peoples was ended by the Egyptian army in the Battle of the Delta, when the Egyptians caught the sea peoples in a location on the Nile Delta where the Egyptian chariots were very effective. The Egyptians had the most well-armed and professional army in the world. Also a very experienced army, thanks to the campaigns of Ramses II, also known as Ozymandias. However, the great Ozymandias had passed on after an insanely long rule, and so the sea peoples were destroyed at least in terms of their military power. Well, what do you know? It happened in 1175 BC. So, Troy was destroyed in 1179, and then a confederation of war bands from the Sicels, the Sardinians, a lot of people that we would now consider Greeks, probably people who knew Odysseus or knew of Odysseus. They definitely were people that could tell you something about Achilleus, aka Achilles. But they were all killed or taken prisoner by the Egyptians in 1175. So you can see that this was a very sudden, precipitous event. Military campaigns worked on a much slower time scale back then than now. The fastest you could go was on some giant ship that had to carry water and equipment with rather primitive sailing technology. So you weren't going to go very fast that way. And the use of horses in warfare by these cultures that we call the Sea Peoples was not very highly developed. In the Iliad, of course, we see Achilles using a chariot. However, the love of horses and the skill in training horses appears to have been something that the Trojans were much more well known for. And we'll talk about the fact that the Trojans were not Greek in any form, ethnically. They appear to have been descended from an Indo-European horse-taming nomadic group from Central Asia. And so all of the horse iconography related to Troy reflects their ancestry, either descended from or heavily influenced by the original group of humans that had domesticated the horse in Central Asia. So, the Trojan horse is an interesting idea in terms of cultural iconography and what it says about how the precursors of the Greeks thought about some of these foreign cultures to the east. Because, as we recall from normal ancient history, once the actual Greeks appear, we know that they weren't super into horses. Cavalry was kind of a Macedonian thing. And as we all know, the Athenians and the Spartans focused very heavily on heavily armored infantry. The Mycenaeans, the Achaioi, the Danaoi, also appeared to rely heavily on infantry and not on cavalry-based raiding. So I think it's getting pretty clear that the fall of Troy and the events that set up the Exodus are the same events. It's all the same big event. Agamemnon's uneasy alliance consisted of warriors from Crete all the way back to Odysseus's far west Ithaca. And remember, they considered themselves an alliance of scattered peoples. They did not have a unified ethnic identity yet. And so this ragtag fleet of ships from all kinds of random locations in the Western Mediterranean crossed the sea and lay siege to a famous rich city on the coast. And this should sound familiar. So Odysseus and Achilles were sea people. It just so happens that is exactly how Odysseus is portrayed in the Odyssey. He's at sea almost all the time in the story. So if Odysseus and his buddies don't count as sea people, then I don't think anybody does. How does this lead us to the Exodus story? What's the connection between the sea people and the Israelites and Moses? Well, it looks like the Iliad is the story of the peak of the success of the sea peoples. They raided a wealthy city. They got all the loot, and a lot of them got home and returned as heroes. But the Battle of the Delta, just 4 years later in Egypt, was quite a different story. How the mighty have fallen. An even larger group of ships landed on the Egyptian coast with plans to march inland and start raiding cities. But it was a bridge too far. Like Icarus, they had flown too close to the sun, or at least the son of the sun god. That's what Ramses means in Egyptian, son of Ra. And the wax on their wings melted, and the Egyptians destroyed them utterly, almost to a man. So the Egyptians faced a very different situation than the Trojans did. The Egyptians did what the Trojans couldn't, which is completely destroy the invaders militarily in an open battle. And so now they've got these prisoners. And in the camps of these raiders from the sea, they weren't all men. As we see in the Iliad, a lot of these warlords brought their concubines with them. And so Ramses III has to deal with this essentially floating city that just washed up on his shore. He just destroyed any military force that this group of strange people from the West had. But Ramses III now has to make a decision. What do you do with these people? Well, of course, the first instinct was basically free labor. That's what happened all the time in the ancient world. And of course, the people who were conquered at the Battle of the Delta expected to be made into slaves. But there were so many of them that it appears that Ramses III had a policy of actually creating these little settlements of slave people, of prisoners, where they were forced to do different kinds of work for the government of Egypt. And I think this is starting to sound kind of familiar. Now, I'm not going to argue that the Israelites come entirely from these groups of sea people. The core of what would become the Israelites had already been in Egypt for a couple of 100 years. And originally, they were not war prisoners or slaves. Originally, they ran the place. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about a guy named Abram and a group of people called the Hyksos. So who is this Abraham guy? His name in Hebrew originally was Avram, kind of like Avram. And when did he live? Definitely a long time before Moses. Abraham was born at the peak of the Bronze Age, not at the ragged, bloody end of the Bronze Age, like Moses. And I'll go ahead and spoil the story a little bit so we can get this out of the way and avoid some confusion. After the man accepted God's mission, his name was changed to Abraham, instead of just Abram. Abraham means father of nations. So the changing of his name was a prophecy about what his descendants would achieve. And he had a lot of them, mainly because he had time, both in terms of living a long, long time. Once again, there's that constant suggestion that we find in these documents that the Bronze Age people lived longer and were taller. So, where did Abraham come from, and when was he born? Abraham is not from what's now Israel, Palestine, or what was called Canaan back then. He wasn't from the Arabian Peninsula. He wasn't born in Egypt or Syria. He was born in good old Mesopotamia, somewhere near the city of Ur. U-R. That's easy to spell. Ur was a city that was built right on the banks of the Euphrates River in what is now southern Iraq. And it was established sometime around 3800 BC. So that is 5,800 years ago. Now that's when the city of Ur was built. Abram appears to have been born sometime around 1800 BC, or shortly after 2000 BC. Once you get as far back as 2000 BC, if the Chinese or the Sumerians or the Egyptians didn't carve something into stone about it, or at least scratch something into a clay tablet or bone fragments, without those kind of records, all the dates are guesses. So this 1800 BC date for Abram, I would take with a grain of salt. And I think, although we don't know very much about Abraham, aside from what's written about him in the Old Testament, I do suspect that he was a real person that had become mythologized as the ages turned over. And this is because we're dealing with cultures that are very particular about their lineages. They defined themselves through their ancestors in a way that we try to avoid, I think, in our culture. So we're going to go ahead and speed run Abram, later known as Abraham's journey. Long story short, according to the Old Testament, God chose this man, Abram, on the banks of the Euphrates, to be the person that he would elevate to a patriarchal status so that God could more or less reintroduce himself to the world. After things had fallen apart in the Garden of Eden, things didn't go well in the very beginning. Humans got off on the wrong foot in terms of their role in creation, according to Genesis. And so now, God has a new plan. It's time to plant the seeds of the intervention into human affairs. And as people familiar with the biblical tradition will know, God tends to work one-on-one with people. He doesn't descend from the heavens to talk to theaters or stadiums full of people. And so Abraham dealt with God alone. And after he accepted the covenant with God, he and his family began to move. And guess where they ended up? You'll never guess this, but Abraham and his family settled in what is now Israel, Palestine. But back then, it was known widely as Canaan or Canaan. We'll talk about the people who happened to be living in Canaan at the time. And the Bible makes it clear that Abraham and his family and their culture did not mix well with the locals. Their beliefs were quite different. Now, later on, we're going to talk about what these differences were, because this division between the Canaanite belief system and the Canaanite culture that was established in that area of the Levant was dramatically different from the belief system of the Israelites. And I think any explanation about who these people are or were and why history turned out the way it did has to wrestle with where did these differences come from? And why were they so extreme? Well, we'll talk about that. But let's go ahead and fast forward to Abraham's grandson, who was named Jacob. The Israelites trace their ancestry back to Jacob, not necessarily Abraham. Abraham's descendants covers a much wider scope of the Middle East than just the Israelites, including Arabic people who also claim descent from Abraham. But boy, is that a different topic. We got to stay on track. So, long story short, Jacob wrestles with an angel and actually defeats the angel, but at the cost of a serious injury. And so this man, Jacob, or Yakub, was renamed Israel, Israel. And Israel means he who fights God, or he who struggles with God. I think that's interesting. So when you think about Israelite, it's sort of like a person descended from the one who fought God. And that's weird. So what's so special about Jacob? Well, what do you know? At the end of Genesis, we're told that the descendants of Jacob, and there were a lot of them, actually emigrated, emigrated, emigrated from Canaan into what is now eastern Egypt. And so how did this happen? Who was in charge of Egypt at the time? So the Bible says that Jacob moved his descendants into Egypt. So about when was this? If Abram first heard God's voice outside of Ur in 1800 BC, then it looks like Jacob and his family immigrated into Egypt around 1600 BC. So 1600 BC, which is about 400 years before the Bronze Age collapse. So my rough, crude timeline for all this is 1800 for Abraham, 1600 for Jacob's descendants moving into Egypt, and 1200 for the collapse and the subsequent exodus, according to my theory. So how did that work? How did a bunch of farmers and herdsmen from Canaan just wander into Egypt and take over some land? Well, that's not really what happened. It looks like this event is associated with an actual historical event that occurred around, 1600 BC. Because we know that from about 1650 BC to 1550 BC, there was this 100-year period where some people from Canaan, who had a partly Mesopotamian culture, actually ran the show in Egypt. They were a foreign minority. They did not adhere to Egyptian culture, and they were described as having come from Canaan. And as outsiders, they brought in new technology and political ideas, and especially new religious ideas, which would become important a little bit later. So the end of Genesis says that Jacob came to Egypt under the stewardship and at the invitation of and under the protection of this guy named Joseph. And what do you know? Joseph was Jacob's 11th son, according to Genesis. 11th is a crazy high number. Even with a long lifespan, these people definitely kept busy on the whole reproduction end of things. So Joseph was Jacob's son, and Genesis says something strange about him. Apparently, Joseph, this young descendant of Abraham, who was originally from Canaan, and whose culture was from Canaan, and ultimately Mesopotamia, this Joseph guy had become a very high-ranking official in the Egyptian government. Joseph was not a regular Joe. So I think that these events are related, and I'm not alone. The settlement of the descendants of Jacob into Goshen appears to have happened around the same time as the rule of the Hyksos over Egypt. I think one thing that characterizes the Bronze Age and then the Bronze Age collapse is this constant movement of people. When you look at the sources from this period, you see a world that is mostly chaotic and full of nomads, wandering herdsmen, raiding horsemen, and then you've got the farmers who all cluster around these city centers for protection from the other people. So people moved a lot. Outside the cities, everything was pretty fluid. We're looking at a period that is so far back, it's kind of in a halfway point between farmers and people who stuck to the older ways of life. So we're seeing prominent families just uproot themselves from Ur, moving to Canaan, which is pretty far away by the standards of the time. Then we have people moving en masse from Canaan into Egypt. And then later, we're going to talk about Western people who colonized Canaan, so that you have Sardinian and Celtic and Sicilian, i.e., sickle DNA, found in a graveyard in Ashkelon. And we'll talk about that. But just know that this idea of these descendants of Abraham moving into Goshen in Egypt and beginning to farm there with some social status. Please note, these people are not coming there to be slaves. They're coming there to be farmers and to be fruitful and multiply. And so let's look at why they did this. Genesis says that there was a famine in Canaan, and Jacob, the patriarch in Canaan, has to swallow his pride. He sends 10 of his sons to Egypt to buy grain. His sons go to Egypt, and just like I would do, they look up their relative, Joseph, because Joseph has some pull in Egypt. And Joseph just tells them, hey, go tell your father to just bring everybody here. We've got some land to settle them on. They don't have to suffer the famine in Canaan with everybody else. Not when I'm a big shot in Egypt. And at this point in the story, when Joseph is explaining to his father how they could immigrate into Egypt, Joseph tells Jacob that when he meets with the Pharaoh, he should make sure and stress the fact that they were shepherds, that they lived a pastoral lifestyle. They were semi-nomadic, and they produced most of their calories and their economic resources from raising livestock, from raising cattle and sheep especially. Now, why did Joseph say this? Genesis seems to make a big deal out of this statement. So what Joseph actually says is, he tells Jacob to make sure to present themselves as pastoral people, quote, so that you may settle in the land of Goshen, because all shepherds are abhorrent to the Egyptians. That's a weird statement. So Egyptians hate shepherds. It also doesn't make sense when you think about, why would you tell the Pharaoh that you're a kind of person that is abhorrent to him? Why are you going to the Pharaoh and saying, hey, we want to settle in Egypt, but I got to tell you, we're not really your cup of tea? That wouldn't make sense. And the real reason why this statement is in Genesis and what it really says about the Egyptians has to do with the fact that this is the Bronze Age. And this tension between people who raise livestock, either nomadic or semi-nomadic, whether they specialize in raising horses or cattle and horses, or just sheep, there was a tension between those people and the settled farmers, the people who labored in the fields to produce wheat and barley. There's a couple of reasons for this tension. First of all, the pastoral groups tended to harass and attack the farming groups. They were the main reason why these farmers became so territorial and always had an army ready, a bunch of spears, some kind of wall. That's because farmers are very much not nomadic, and they have to defend their land because their land is their food. If they get kicked off their land, they die. We have to remember that full-scale agriculture is still relatively new. It's only a few thousand years old. It's spread pretty gradually out of Mesopotamia. So let's not forget that even at the peak of the Bronze Age, human agriculture was relatively new, and it was still restricted to these scattered, small, but densely populated cities. But if you look at the totality of humanity at the time, in all the scattered areas where they lived, they were either still hunting and gathering, or they were pastoral people. Herdsmen, horsemen, shepherds. The other reason for the tension is that one will convert into the other. These two ways of life were practiced right next to each other, sometimes by the same people. So if you were a farmer in the Bronze Age, you kind of always had it in the back of your mind or in your back pocket that if things got real bad and you had to abandon your farm, you could do shepherd work. You could manage livestock, because then you could be on the move. And back then, there was still a lot of empty land. It wasn't like the late Middle Ages. There was actually a lot of land available for people. So when we look back at stories from the Bronze Age, we very often see farmers becoming shepherds. And then we also see shepherds becoming farmers. Later on in the Bible, we'll meet a shepherd named David who would end up ruling a little empire of farmers. And so that explains the tension between farmers and herders. So why did Joseph tell Jacob to tell the Pharaoh that they were pastoral people? Wouldn't that be presenting yourself as a threat? Well, yeah. But we have to interpret the word abhorrent in the quote in the more fundamental or ancient sense, which is just something you want to turn away from, something that you don't want near you, not something that you want to hunt down and destroy, or that you have to build a wall to protect against. And so Joseph's plan was that the Pharaoh would hear this and say, okay, well, these are not people we want living in any of the major cities, and we don't want them in the nice, beautiful farming territories of our nobility. So, let's settle them in this patch of land that's not particularly productive and is away from the ethnically Egyptian population. And we'll let these foreigners, these weird Canaanites, we'll let them do their thing in this territory. And so, there is a connection between what we see in Egyptian history and what we read at the end of Genesis. But then, when we get to the Exodus story, 400 years later, when we're shown the land of Goshen in the Exodus story, things are a little different. It's pretty clear that Abraham's descendants are not exactly in power. They have taken on a servile condition. They have become second-class citizens. They are being exploited as cheap labor. So where back in 1600 BC, when the Hyksos were in charge, when people like Joseph were around, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were a free and prosperous minority of people who had a great deal of influence over the Pharaoh himself. But then, 400 years later, around the time of Ozymandias and his successor, and Moses, the Israelites were at their low point. Right around the time that all these other foreigners were settled into Egypt. And so what I'm going to argue is that the stories at the end of Genesis and the Exodus story have a lot of events that have been compressed and combined. And so the presence of this foreign identity that we'll call Israelite, and in particular, their distinct religious practices, being transplants, ultimately from Mesopotamia. This foreign identity had taken root in Egypt for the last 400 years. But, as we'll see, growing economic problems, tensions between the social classes, tensions between the nobility and the pharaoh, and in particular, tensions between all of the Egyptians and all of these angry, destitute foreigners that had been settled in the peripheries of Egypt in the last few hundred years. And then especially under Ramses III, who I like to call Lil Ramses, when Lil Ramses made a compromise with the Sea Peoples after their defeat and settled some of them in Egypt. I'm going to argue that completed the construction of a gigantic powder keg, a powder keg of rebellion and violence between the ethnic groups. And the Exodus story, I think, is the story of an Egyptian rebel leader who unites a faction of foreigners, in particular, foreigners that share the religious practices that Jacob's descendants brought into Egypt. And the Exodus story is a compressed, embellished, mythologized account of what took place. And so we'll talk about all of that stuff, the plagues of Egypt, what those may have been, the parting of the Red Sea, the burning bush, the giving of the 10 Commandments to Moses. We'll cover all that stuff. We're also going to do some ethnic detective work. Who were the Canaanites? And by extension, who were the Israelites? We're going to talk about some DNA evidence that shows a sudden influx of people with European DNA settling around the area of Ashkelon in the 12th century BC. What do you know? I think that's a sign of more incursions and settlement of sea peoples from the west in the Levant. And speaking of the west, we'll talk a little bit more about Mycenaean Athens and how it survived all of this stuff. Remember, Athens was one of the few cities that wasn't destroyed. We'll also talk more about the Ramseses. Ramses II, aka Ozymandias, and Ramses III, aka Lil Ramses, who was a distant relative. He was not the son of Ozymandias. He certainly did not have the same abilities. But, I have kind of a soft heart for this guy. I mean, he had to live up to Ramses II, who was the man. In terms of pharaohs, he was kind of the goat. But now Lil Ramses had to face down this huge invasion of bandits from the sea. Then he had to deal with all these internal revolts and rebellions among the lower classes at home in Egypt. We're going to talk about the first labor strike ever recorded in history, which occurred in Egypt. What do you know? Right around the time of the beginning of the Exodus story, these people were complaining about no pay, no food, terrible conditions. Then we're going to talk about the real straw that broke the camel's back. And this one's a little more speculative. What I'm going to do is, I'm going to side with the people who pinpoint the date of the eruption of a volcano called Hekla in Iceland. I'm going to side with the people who date this eruption to the time of the Exodus. The other estimate for the date of this eruption is closer to 900 BC, which is way too recent. That couldn't have contributed to the events of the Exodus. But if it did happen at the time the first theory suggests, then it was the death knell, the nail in the coffin for Bronze Age civilization. We're talking a mini-nuclear winter. 7 years with no crops. That will definitely spur people on to do dramatic things, destructive things, and I think that would definitely explain the complete destruction and the partial forgetting of what had happened before. We have regions where people went from having indoor ceramic plumbing to living in caves in some cases. So I'm going to argue that the Exodus, and in particular the plagues of Egypt, are remembrances of an ecological and economic disaster. We know for a fact that Egypt was never the same after these events. It endured, but it was never again a world power, a major player on the world stage. Once again, we can go back to Alexander. Alexander the Great, quote-unquote, conquered Egypt without spilling a drop of blood. He kind of just walked in because Egypt did not have the military power to make any kind of stand against him. So we'll cover all that in the next volume. We'll be talking more about these people who are kind of Greeks, but not Greeks yet. People who might become Romans later on. People who aren't Jews yet, but they're getting there. Like I said earlier, the story of the Bronze Age collapse is the story of the creation of new ethnic groups. The people who would lead and influence Western civilization in the Iron Age. And so the last thing I want to mention is that a lot of people think that because the technology of this time period is very crude by our standards, that means that the people were crude. But I think it's the reverse. I think they're kind of an inversion of us. We have very sophisticated technology that's designed to service a very crude culture. They had crude technology that served a sophisticated culture. They had more rules, not less. So we're going to talk more about the folk psychology and the narratives that are related to these ancient cultures, especially their religious beliefs and how they differed, and importantly, how they influenced what came later, how they became the religious and mythological traditions that we study today. And so, until then, talk to you later.